declaring a national emergency.
New York has the greatest need in terms of numbers.
These families, these lost souls.
The federal government is distributing more than 8 million N95 respirators.
Social distancing is evident almost everywhere.
This number of new claims for unemployment benefits is truly unprecedented.
We can't let the economy collapse.
We have a bipartisan agreement on the largest rescue package in American history.
China doesn't want the real story to be told.
The Chinese regime's propaganda arm is trying to shift the blame.
Blame on the United States.
It's not going to happen, not as long as I'm president.
It's not a Chinese virus. It's not a Wuhan virus. This is the CCP virus.
Welcome to Zooming In Coronavirus Special. I'm Simone Gao. The U.S. now has the most confirmed cases of the CCP virus or coronavirus in the world. More than 139,700 cases and more than 2,400 deaths. New York State alone has more than 1,000 deaths. Italy's death toll is now the highest in the world, with over 10,000 by now. President Trump extended social distancing guidelines to April 30th. U.S. Treasury Secretary says Americans could expect stimulus checks to arrive in 3 weeks. Today, my guest is Jack Maxey, co-host of War Room Pandemic with Steve Bannon. How are you, Jack?
I'm doing very well, Simone. How are you?
Okay, thank you. When I look at today's numbers, I realized one thing. We all know we have not yet reached the peak of this pandemic in America. President Trump said the death toll will probably peak in 2 weeks. However, if you look at the numbers, the U.S. has already more confirmed cases than China. According to the CCP numbers, China altogether from the very beginning to now only has 81,470 cases. The U.S. is now 139,700 cases as of today. New York alone has more than 10,000 deaths, and the entire China had 3,304 deaths from the very beginning. China locked down Wuhan on January 24th. Before that, they did nothing. The first case in China could appear in November. So what's your thoughts when you see these numbers?
Well, we know that those numbers are nonsense. I don't think anybody can deny that they are not real. Certainly, China still has the disease flowing through the population. In no place is it as bad as Wuhan, but let's get real. We've talked about this before. What makes anybody think that the experience of Chinese people is any different than the experience of Italian people or American people or French people or Spanish people? There is no difference. So we know that the CCP lied. And let's also remember, all the way up until the 14th of January, the World Health Organization, our friend, the Maoist Tedros, the client of Chairman Xi and the CCP at the World Health Organization, was still telling the world that this was not even transmissible between human beings. Now, to show you what a lie this is from the World Health Organization and also from the Communist Party of China, we know now that Taiwan, Free China, told the World Health Organization on the 31st of December that they had clinical proof that this disease was communicable between human beings. Now, the World Health Organization didn't even come out and acknowledge that, I think, until maybe the 19th or 20th of January. So you see these two groups working in cooperation, the Communist Party of China, the World Health Organization, and now the World Health Organization is run by a guy, Tedros, who's a member of the Maoist Party of Ethiopia. I mean, you don't have to do much calculus to figure out where his sympathies lie. And together, the Communist Party of China and I believe the World Health Organization put the entire world at risk. And I want to be very clear to the people of Wuhan, who I have a lot of admiration for, that they were the first victims of this evil system that you suffer under in China. Because let's remember, you had the 10,000 Families Party on the 18th of January with 40,000 faithful cadre of the party itself. So they were willing to betray those people who are even party members. Imagine what they feel about the rest of the Chinese citizenry. And now we know this because all over the world, Chinese succeed everywhere they go, just hardworking, good people. And to see them just be constantly abused and have every day a little bit more realize that you guys are slaves to a system that does not care about your health or your well-being. You are literally pawns for a master plan that does not value you at all. And I hope that the Chinese people can start to realize that they are individuals with aspirations and hopes and a voice. And I hope that China can become a place where those voices can be heard, because the world wants to hear you sing.
Yes, I think that will happen at some point. Do you think the World Health Organization would be held accountable at some point?
I think that the World Health Organization is kind of proof of these non-governmental organizations that we all suffer under around the world, from the United Nations to the World Health Organization. We give them $220 million a year. And the same is true. China gives them about $120 million a year, and the rest of the world fills up the gap. But clearly, $120 million buys you more cooperation than $220 does. So when you have an organization whose responsibility is the health of planet Earth, and their first concern is the reputation of the Communist Party of China versus the health of the global population. And also, let's be straightforward, the World Health Organization betrayed China too, because people in China thought they were safe for much longer than they should have.
A video from China went viral recently, and it showed thousands of urns at a truck at one of 8 funeral homes in Wuhan. The caption reads, "The driver said this truck is carrying around 2,500 urns. Yesterday, a truck unloaded almost the same amount. Many families have to wait 5 hours because there have been too many urns and too little manpower." So I just want to point out the timeline. This report came out on March 26, and it says the Chinese family were able to pick up the urns starting from March 23rd. And within the last 2 weeks, and this happened in Wuhan, within the last 2 weeks, the Chinese media, the Chinese medical authorities have been reporting there had been no new cases in China. And, in Wuhan, there have been no new cases in 5 days. So this large amount of urns surfaced on March 26th, March 23rd. What does that tell you?
Well, I saw the video and I saw the pictures, and I read several different accounts of how many there were. I had heard up to 45,000 urns overall spread between the more than a dozen funeral homes in Wuhan. So, listen, I think we have to be clear about this. China has lied from the beginning. China is lying today. The very notion that there are no more infections in China except for infections that come from foreigners, right, is just patently ridiculous, especially because now we know that a significant portion, say 75, 80%, according to the Germans, may capture the disease with very few symptoms. So we know that there is still person-to-person contact occurring inside China. And a little tell today, one of our viewers sent me a text from his wife in Beijing, and apparently they have just now reclosed all the theaters and they've shut down one of the main drags in Beijing. So if there's no problem, why are we continuing to reimpose measures that shouldn't be necessary if there is no transmission inside China? So listen, while we want China to recover and to get healthy, one of the biggest problems with that, and the Chinese people should be very understanding about this, if you don't know what's going on, if you are not able to get the information from the rest of the world and even from the province next to yours inside China, how are you as an individual going to make decisions that'll help yourself? And this gets right to the heart of the problem with your leadership. They don't want you to know. They make decisions for you. And when they make decisions for you, your health and safety are not a priority. And Wuhan should be proof of that to everybody in China.
Right. You know, Business Insider reports Boris Johnson's government is furious with China and believes that it could have 40 times the number of coronavirus cases it says. One official said there could be a reckoning once the COVID-19 crisis was over. The Huawei deal could be redone. So tell me, Jack, especially for our Chinese audience who are watching our program, why are CCP's lies about the numbers so upsetting to the British, to the Western world?
Well, I think you have to remember that the CCP lying about the numbers is really secondary to the real problem. They lied about the fact that they had a novel coronavirus spreading through the area. And also, let's be real, the Chinese people themselves would have reacted differently if the virus had been described correctly. This is a SARS virus. This is the, twin brother of SARS-1. Now, perhaps not as lethal, but certainly more communicable. And they were aware of all these things. And now we find out that they were aware all the way back to November. The delay in telling the rest of the world allowed hundreds of millions of Chinese to travel around inside China. I mean, they spread it from the epicenter of Wuhan to every province in China over Lunar New Year. And then they allowed this disease to be spread to every country on planet Earth before we really had an understanding of just how dangerous and how communicable it was. So absolutely, China has a responsibility here. And this responsibility does not lie with the Chinese people. I can't make it clear enough that this blame that the world is throwing in your direction is not to the people. It is to your leadership. And your leadership, they're not really leaders. They're just masters, because they don't lead you. To lead you would mean that they would be at the head. Instead, they're at the back pushing you into danger. So, let's be clear. We love the Chinese people. In fact, the other day, and maybe this will give your viewers some hope, a dear Chinese friend of mine, when I said, we should start using the namaste, because an Indian friend said that to me. And she said something I thought was very beautiful and hopeful. She said we should start using the old Chinese greeting, which is like this. And so in honor of the Chinese people, I've been doing that and explaining to everybody what it means, and really because I want the world to know that the Chinese people need to be free.
Right. Well said. I want to ask you a technical question. It is, how this coronavirus really works. Studies show that the possibility of being infected by an asymptomatic person is 4.1% compared to a 6.3% by a person who has symptoms. So the difference is not that big. And Taiwan experts say a person could carry the virus and remain asymptomatic for up to 40 days. If so, what does this mean to the draconian measures that we think are very effective and that have flattened the curve? Is the results only temporary?
Well, Simone, you're getting into dangerous territory asking me this question. I have not been a huge fan of the total lockdown of the country. I think you got to deal with it where it's hottest and direct all your resources to the fires themselves rather than trying to spread water all over the country. So I'm not necessarily a 100% believer, and I can kind of support that because you've seen the Scandinavian countries and you've seen Germany particularly with a huge number of cases. I think Germany's like 4th or 5th in the world at this point, but that's because Germany has done massive testing. And also, Germany has a mortality rate of those tested of less than 0.5%. So this really changes the death numbers that we got out of Wuhan, which I think were 4.2, and then what we're seeing out of Italy, which is even significantly higher than that. So one thing that we have to remember is that because there are so many asymptomatic people, when all throughout the West, and this is actually true in China too, the only people that they tested or that they are testing for the most part today are people that are sick, just because it requires that I put on PPEs and change them out each time I do the test, right? So it becomes a question of like, do we want to do a test on an asymptomatic person, or do we want to have an extra N95 mask? And the default is the N95 mask. But I think that we're going to see how this plays out. I mean, I think something for your viewers to watch. I think it's fascinating in a way, because much of the third world is going to have to deal with this virus in this fashion. Bolsonaro in Brazil basically came out yesterday and he said, we've got a real tough fight on our hands, but you want to fight like a man, not a boy. And then he turned around and he said, hey, people, we're all going to die sometime. And he said, this is just something that we have to deal with. And I think he said, es la vida. It's like, it's life. And unfortunately, much of the third world is going to have to deal with this that way. And it'll be, to me, it will be very fascinating to see how that plays out, because that will be the opposite of what we're doing. And I'm curious to know what the outcome will be. But he's really the outlier in that regard at this point.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I am in support of the draconian measures too. But I just, when I read this studies, this question came to me. If so many people are asymptomatic and it can carry the virus for 40 days or even longer, then how many days can you lock down a country or city? So that's the question.
Here's an interesting historical parallel that will give people, I think, a little bit of understanding of how these diseases work. And we hear experts say, 50% may be infected, up to 80%. Gabriel Ling, the doctor from Hong Kong, said early on probably 60 to 80% of the population will be infected of planet Earth, okay? Now, with the H1N1 virus that came out of Mexico, an avian flu, incorrectly originally described as a swine flu, which the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, I think, on week 3. Again, another tell concerning their allegiance to the CCP instead of the people of the world. But the H1N1 virus, if you test the American population today, roughly between 50-60%, or maybe I'll give it larger, 40 to 60%, 50% of the population has the antibodies to this once thought lethal virus. And this virus is actually still spreading amongst us. I was given a report of about 2 weeks ago of a young child in Des Moines, Iowa, who had passed away from this illness. So these things don't go away. This likely will not go away. Hopefully, if we get a vaccine, it'll be able to get under control. But I'm really of the belief that we're going to get the first cycle here through the spring into the summer. I think it'll likely follow the pattern of the 1918 pandemic and come back again in the fall, with a likelihood that we have tailing cases all the way through next spring. I know that's not what anyone wants to hear, but to me, to a certain extent, it argues against the idea of shutting everything down. And to give you an idea, in the 1918 pandemic in New York City, the city had a fantastic health department, almost organized around dealing with infectious diseases. They had, early in the century, right around 1900, they had an awful smallpox outbreak in the city that killed many, many people. And then they also had a horrible situation where in the tenements, particularly in southern Manhattan, they were having this explosion of tuberculosis. Well, these great doctors in New York City went to get into it. They separated the city block by block. They had different people in charge of everything. All of the responsibilities were zeroed down, and they'd had recent experience. Well, when the influenza comes to New York in early August, but it really doesn't start to take off in the city till September, they immediately institute some quarantines of shipping. And then later, as the thing starts to break out, they create some rules inside New York City, and to me, they're very fascinating. Instead of shutting down the whole city, they just gave businesses alternate days in which they could operate, or alternate hours within a day that they could operate. So everything in the city was kept running at about 50%. And the idea was to never have more than, say, 25, 30% of the employees in the city at any given time. Otherwise, they would be at home. And the health commissioner, believe it or not, he never shut down the schools the entire time. And many times he was criticized for this, and his explanation was, well, listen, these kids are at school where they're getting healthy meals. They're being taught about washing their hands, not touching their face, all the measures that we're talking about now. But if we send them home to their, impoverished state, they're actually at greater risk than they would be at school. And at least at school, the teachers were monitoring the health of each child as they came in the door for symptoms. And this created a kind of early warning system for the epidemiologists at that time. Now, that was a much more lethal disease. That disease tended to kill people 35 and under. So roughly between 15 and 35 was the death zone for this, the complete opposite of what we're looking at here, which is, say, 70 to 90. And yet, New York City, over about a 3-month period, and again, they took a little hit in the spring, but they lost 30,000 people, and they never went into a state of panic. And I think that one of the things that we have to acknowledge here is most of the people who are dying of this disease are in their 80s. And you can look at the demographic study coming out of Italy, and now, granted, it's tragic, but they've only had one victim under 20 in all of Italy, and I think they've had 7 under 29. And so you have to look at it from the perspective of, if all the guys who pour concrete and, build houses are likely not to get sick, why would you keep them from work? To me, from early days, my instructions were to simply isolate the elderly, defend them rigorously, make them the full focus of the nation's plan. But, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm just a guy who's done a lot of research on this and has an opinion. So take that for what it's worth. But I do feel that in some regards we've gone overboard. Now, we had to do this to a certain extent because we didn't have the testing capabilities early on to really get our hands around it.
That's right. We have already missed that opportunity. And I think it's almost the draconian measures are the only thing left that's, we have seen effective.
Simone, the one thing I question about that is everything we know about the Chinese government's approach to this has been based upon lies, right? And we know what they did in Wuhan, and we know what the outcome for Wuhan was. It was not a good outcome. To anybody saying that this has been like some amazing success, particularly if the revelations concerning the Urns are true, and we're looking at 40 or 50,000 dead, or maybe more, then how great was their draconian measure? I mean, there is some debate right now concerning the viral load that is required to make one very, very sick. This goes to the point of asymptomatic carriers not spreading it as much as people who are sick, because if I'm not coughing, I'm not necessarily spreading a viral load. So if we think about the some of the measures, this is why quarantining people in dense population structures like an apartment building, this is probably, in my mind, and I know this is against the grain, to me, that probably spread the disease up and down through those buildings. And we saw this in SARS-1 many times in Hong Kong. This was the case.
Within the same household and even within the same building, I think the transmission rate is high. So people get infected from their family members. I think that's for sure.
Right. And then what happens is, because of close contact with an infected person, the likelihood of you getting a viral load that is large enough that it can create the immune response in you that causes the problems is probably higher. Now, I'm really curious if I had something that I was sort of excited about from an intellectual standpoint, it's going to be the results of these antibody studies in Germany, because if their ideas are true that a vast proportion of the German population has already been infected, then it kind of changes
80?
the rationale for a total shutdown. But having said that, the Germans have essentially gone to pretty much a total shutdown as of the end of last week.
Well, I just think we have so many things that we don't know about this virus and how it behaves. So
You're right. And I say this to people a lot, Simone. You're very smart to say that. I mean, let's get real. This virus has only been in the hands of Western medicine for, 4 or 5 weeks? This is the only clinical experience we have with this new virus. I am pretty hopeful about some of the antiviral therapeutics that are out there, and we've talked about that in the past. And one thing that's interesting, perhaps, if these antiviral treatments actually work, the hydroxychloroquine and the azithromycin and the remdesivir, which is made by Gilead Science, if these things really work, in a way, it's kind of an indictment of the Chinese scientific and medical establishment, because they claimed that they did studies with chloroquine and it was no better than anything else they did. But when you read their study, it's a really poorly done study. They had one control group getting the chloroquine, and then the other group was getting a cocktail of up to 6 or 7 different antivirals. So, you know, it wasn't a very good study to have made a determination. And when you compare that with the similar studies that are done in a much more controlled thing, but still kind of anecdotal because the level of sickness of the patients and things is all different. But in southern France, in Marseille, they just published some numbers yesterday with 2 groups. One was 965 people. The other was, I think, 1,002. The one group got the normal palliative treatment that they give to everybody. And so in the 965, they had 12 people die. In the other group, that was 965, they had 1 person die, an 89-year-old man. So to me, anecdote, yes, we need more science, but my understanding is this is being prescribed in New Jersey at the hospitals there. They're doing a massive study in New York City. There was a document published by the government of India just, I believe, yesterday that is recommending the use of hydroxychloroquine as a prophylactic among their healthcare workers. I think that we're probably going to see that here too. So it's interesting. You know, you've got all of Western medicine here together, collaborating, sharing information. Imperial College of London, Hong Kong University, Stanford, University of Washington, Harvard. All these people are sharing information. And as they share information, different ideas are promulgated and different theories. And this is how we solve problems. And so you look at what China did, and they don't have that openness, that ability to discuss freely different ideas. And so in a sad way, wouldn't it be awful if China missed this because of their practices rather than their innate intelligence and abilities? But the structure is such that because you can't share information, everybody's flying blind. And that's to me is somewhat of an indictment of what's going on in China, because, listen, the world learns about new diseases and learns about new medical procedures and scientific leaps forward because we share information. Whereas China keeps all their information, and they're quite good at taking information from us, as we saw with the Harvard chemistry professor who was just arrested for collaborating with the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that will be an interesting thing, because I think it will be a big tell concerning the state of scientific study inside China.
Right. I agree with you. After this crisis, the world will look at the CCP very differently.
Absolutely. And why shouldn't they? I mean, we've for the last 20 years we've tried to play this game that like Chairman Xi's just like any other leader. He's not like any other leader. This is like the Tony Montana of China. I mean, he's a gangster. So to accord him the same sort of respect as democratically elected leaders throughout the world is, to me, somewhat shameful. I think that we must.
That's just wrong.
Yeah, I think at every time, at every moment, we must highlight the fact that the Chinese people need to be able to have self-determination. They need to be able to decide what they want to do, where they want to study, where they want to live, who they want to marry, what kind of job that they want to have. It should not be dictated always from the top down. And, the civilians in China are the ones who always suffer. They take care of the power structure, and if a few million on the side have to die, then so be it, because the party is more important than any person. And if you look at the way we are in the West, the person is more important than the party, right? Individual rights are enshrined in the way we think. And I would love to see China one day operate on the same principles, because I think it would just be an unstoppable country and a wonderful partner for the whole world, which is not what they are today, sadly.
Thank you, Jack. That's it for today's CCP Virus Special. You are watching Zooming In with Simone Gao. Please also download our podcast from Spotify, iTunes, and Google, and be sure to come back next time.